Welcome to the final project of this course. In this project, we're going to be building out a fully functional shopping cart that spans across multiple pages, stores all of this across multiple pages, and over on this right-hand side, I have both the working example that we're going to end this video with, as well as the starting example, so that you can download the starting source code, which just has all the HTML and CSS for us, and also so that you can try this out yourself. So let me explain what we're going to build. That way you can try to build it yourself first before watching me build it. So if we go over to this working version, you can see we have a home page, we have a store page, and we have a team page. This team page and home page really don't matter very much. There's not going to be any real changes made to them. They're just there so that we can see how this would work spanning across multiple pages. Because if we were going back to the store page, we can click one of these add to cart buttons. For example, we add red to our cart. And now you can see our shopping cart pops up. It has an indicator telling us how many items are in our cart. And when we click on this, you can see we have our red item in the cart. And if we wanted, we click this X button to remove it. If we were to add multiple red items to our cart, you'll see that it actually increments our number. So we click it, now says we have 2 of them, and it properly calculates the total. We could get 3 of them. We could add yellow, and now you can see yellow is added inside of here. Let's just add green. And you can see we can add multiple things to this cart. And then when we swap pages, for example, to the home page, you can see we can still access all the items inside of our cart. We could remove red, for example, go back to our store. You can see that just persists across all of these different pages. And as soon as we remove everything from our cart, you can see the shopping cart icon completely hides itself until we add something else to the cart and then it reappears. So that's pretty much what the final product is going to look like. And you can kind of imagine that the way that this got brought about is that you have some designer or CSS person on your team that built out this static version of the site that has the home page, the store page, and the team page, and everything in here is hard coded. You can see I can't interact with any of this. There's no JavaScript at all. It's just all hard coded to give you an idea of what the page is supposed to look like and do. And now you have all of the HTML, all of the CSS needed for these different designs, and your job is to implement the functionality. On top of that, there's this items.json file here. Essentially, you can think about this as your database, but instead of diving into the depths of making a database in a server, we're just using a simple JSON file. And as you can see, this JSON file describes each one of the items inside of our store. Right now, these items are hard-coded inside of this store.html file. You can see each one of these items is inside of here hard-coded. But what we want to do is actually use this items.json file in order to get all of these individual items in our store and populate them on the HTML dynamically inside of JavaScript. So that's one of the assignments. And the other assignment is, of course, to get this shopping cart icon to work. So with all that information, the very last thing you need to know is that you can use the class invisible, just spelled out invisible, just like that, to hide anything you want. So if we go to our store, for example, we scroll all the way down where we have our shopping cart, which if we just go up here, you can see this section right here is our shopping cart. We can just say class equals invisible. And if I save that, you can see this shopping cart disappears over here. So you can use this invisible class to hide anything that you want. Other than that, you pretty much have all the information that you need. This is going to be a fairly challenging project because not only is the HTML fairly complex, there's a lot of classes being applied to different things, but on top of that, this is code that you're not familiar with in any way. You have to first be able to look at the code and read the code and understand what the different sections mean. And luckily, the HTML is fairly well laid out, but it doesn't really have nice class names for you to look at to figure out what things are. So you really have to, read through the code, use the inspection tool inside of the Chrome DevTools. If I look over here, you can kind of see when you hover over different items, it'll show you where it is on the page to give you a little bit of an idea of where the HTML corresponds with the elements on the page. But it's going to be a bit of a challenge to read through the code and figure out where everything is. Then from there, implementing the population of all these different items, as well as the shopping cart, are going to be the tasks for this project. I'd recommend trying this out yourself, or at least trying to get started with it before watching me build the entire thing, because this is going to be a challenging project and is a great way to really push your skills to the limit. So with all that out of the way, the very first thing that I want to do with this project is to set up Parcel, because that way we can use the Parcel bundler and we can use modules and all of that transpiling and everything happens for us, so we don't have to worry about it ourselves. So inside of our console, I'm just going to type in npm init-y, hit enter. That'll give me a package.json file. Then I'm going to type in npm i-save dev parcel bundler. And this will give us the parcel bundler, and I'll come back to you when this finishes. So now that that just finished, if we open up our package.json, we can set up our parcel scripts. We're going to have a start script, and this start script is going to run parcel. And normally we run parcel index.html. But here we have 3 different pages. We have an index page, a store page, and a team page. So we need to pass all of these different pages to our parcel command so it knows to build each one of them. This is going to build up all those different files for us. And then we can just copy this because this is going to be our build command. And our build command inside of parcel is just going to run parcel build for all same different files, for all three of these different files. So now if we save this, we close out of this current working version and we run npm start, we should see parcel start up for us. And you can see it says right here, HTTP localhost 1234. And if we open this up, you can see that we have access to this entire project. And we can just close out this live server version because we're not going to need it. And here we are with all of our HTML hard-coded and everything working just like we want inside of parcel. The last thing that I want to do is if we're going to be using this with Git, for example, if we just did a quick git init here, if you have Git installed, that'll initialize this repository with Git. We want to create a git ignore to ignore the node modules dist and cache. So we'll just create a new file called the .git ignore. We'll pass in, node modules. We're going to pass in dist and .cache. This is just going to take all three of those different folders and stop them from being committed to our GitHub repository, which is exactly what we want. So now that we have parcel set up, we have our website running, we have our git ignore, our package JSON, all of that is done. The next step is to figure out what the best place to start our programming is going to be. So what I like to do is take a look at all of the different requirements and features for this application as a great place to start with a big idea. And for us, there's really only two main features of this application. We have our store page, which requires us to populate all of the items on our store page from this items.json file, which is over here. So that's going to be one of our requirements for this project. And the other requirement, which is much larger in my opinion, is the entirety of this shopping cart. And this shopping cart has a lot of smaller requirements inside of it, but the large requirement is to get the shopping cart icon to work completely. So I think the best place for us to start is going to be with populating all of this information from our items.json file, just because it's going to be the most straightforward way for us to start. It's the smallest of all of the features, and it really allows us to just get started by building something that we're pretty fairly comfortable with. Generally, when I'm starting a project, no matter what the size is, I try to find the smallest, easiest thing that I can tackle first, just so I can get diving into the code head first and doing something simple while I'm also reading through the code and learning all of this stuff. Because I don't want to have my mind thinking about how the shopping cart is going to work while also trying to parse all of the code inside of this file. I want to do something really simple that requires me to look at a very small section of the code. That way I'm not trying to dive in deep, I'm just trying to look at an overall view of everything and tackling the quickest and easiest task first, which in my opinion is populating all of this information from the items.json file. You could do whatever you want first, but this is what I'm going to do first. Obviously, to do this, we're going to need some form of JavaScript file. Let's just create a file here called store.js, because this is going to be only for our actual store page. And what I could do is inside of the store.html, I could come up here and import that store.js script, but then I would also need to create a script for the shopping cart and import that as well. And generally that just gets a little bit more confusing than I really want to deal with. What I'm going to do is create another JavaScript file called script.js. And this is where I'm going to import both my shopping cart code and my store code. You may not do this right away at the very beginning. You may start with just store.js, build all that, and then realize this script.js is a good idea. But from my experience, I find it easier just to have one JavaScript file in your HTML instead of importing a bunch of different JavaScript files, unless it really makes sense performance-wise. So inside of this script.js, all I want to do is import something from store.js, some form of setup script. So what I can do inside of here is just create a function, which we're going to export. We're just going to call this setup store. And this function is going to do all of the population of our different store items. And then inside of our script.js, I can just import that setup store function from /store.js, and then I can just come down here and run setup store. So all I'm doing is I'm creating a script.js file, which is setting up our store for us, and then in our store.js down here, we can actually run this function, create this function, and do all the stuff we need for setting up our store. So now in our store.html file, we can just import that script, which is script.js, and let's just make sure we defer that. Now with that done, we can move on to our store.js script and actually start writing out the code we need in order to import these items.json. And the nice thing about Parcel is it actually just lets us directly import this JSON file. Normally you'd have to do a fetch request to get this, but with Parcel, all we can do inside of here is just say that we want to import items from /items.json. Now if we just do a console.log of items, we save this and we come and inspect over here, go to our console, you'll see that we have an array of 8 different items being printed out. You also notice we get an uncaught syntax error unexpected token on team.js. This seems to just be a problem with Parcel not correctly handling this HTML file as an HTML file. It doesn't actually cause any issues with our code though, as we can see by this being printed out. So hopefully this just resolves itself and we don't actually have to worry about it. But for now, this error, if you see this, don't worry about it. So you can see we have each of our different items being printed out. We have the category, the ID, the color, the name, as well as the price in cents. So now what I want to do, now that we have access to all these items, is I want to actually take these items and make an HTML element out of each of them. And as you probably already know, the best way to do that is with templates. So instead of our store, let's just look here where we can find what one of our items looks like. The best way to do this would just be to inspect it, and all we want to do is select an individual whole element. So if we just click here, you can see we get the bottom section. If we go up a little bit, you can see this is the image. And right here, this contains everything. This div with the class large W1/4, medium W1/2, and so on. This is our entire element. And as you can see, when I hover over each one on the right side of my screen, it's moving me through all of the different elements in our store. So I need to take this div full of all of this information and turn it into a template instead. So if we look in our HTML, you can see right here, we have this section with the large W1/4, medium W1/2, and so on. This entire div, we want to turn into a template. So I'm just going to copy this, collapse both of these sections, come down to the bottom and create a template. Let's just give it an ID here, which is going to say store item template. Since this is a store item, and then inside of the template, I just want to paste all of that code that we just copied. And now what I need to do is I need to take each section that I need to add information to. So in our items.json, we just scroll to the top here, we have an ID, which we need to put on something. So what I'm going to do is put the ID on this very top element here. We're going to give it a data attribute so we can select it. We're just going to say data store item. This will let us select this particular element inside of our entire store item here. Next thing that we need to do if we look at our items.json is the name. So if we look for where the name is, you'll see right here, we have our red. So we can just add data name to this so that we know that this is where the name is going to be placed. We can even get rid of this placeholder name right here. Next, if we go back to our items.json, we have the category. So if I look for our category, you can see it's right here. Let's just delete that and add a data category here so that we can select this in our JavaScript. Next up is our price in cents. So we have our price, which is right here. Let's just delete the placeholder. And what we want to do is say data price. And then back into our item.json, we have our image color. And this image color is really only useful for our URL. You can see we add the color to the end of our URL here. So we just need to get the data image. And we can just delete this entire source right here since we're going to populate this inside of the JavaScript. So we've got rid of all of the placeholder data. We've added data attributes to everything that we want to select. And we created a template for what we're going to be doing. Let's just save this. And what we can do is move over into our store.json and get this template. So I'm just going to copy the ID over. And I'm going to say here, const store item template is equal to document.query selector. And I want to select that ID. So now we have access to our store item template. So now with that store item template, we can just create a function, and we don't want to export this function because it's only going to be used in this file. So we're just going to create a normal function called render store item, and we're going to pass it in one of the items from our list. But then what we can do instead of our setup store is we can say items.forEach. We want to call that render store item function. So we're going to be recalling this function for each one of our items, and it'll be passing in the individual item itself. Then we can take this store item template and clone this. So we can say our store item is going to be equal to our store item template dot content dot clone node of true, since we want to get all the content inside of it. Now we have access to our store item, which is essentially just this template right here. And we need to access all of these individual sections. The first one is our store item. We could just say here, const container, because this is going to be the container, is equal to store item dot query selector. And this is a data attribute, which is data store item, just like that. So this gives us the container, which is where we're going to put the ID of our item. The only reason that we're doing this is so that we can link between our item.json here, which is like our database, and the actual HTML. We need this ID in order to do that, because a product could have the same name, it could have the same category, it could have the same price, could have the same image color. None of these are really unique. This ID is unique between them, so it's going to be the way we map between our items.json database and our actual HTML here. So back into our store, what we want to do is just say container.dataset.item ID is going to be equal to our item.id. There we go, pretty straightforward. So we're taking the ID of our item and we're setting it to this dataset item ID. Now the next thing that I want to do is let's just see, we'll get our name next. And if you remember, we gave our name this attribute data name. We can just say const name is equal to store item.querySelector of data name. We could say name dot inner text is equal to item dot name. So for now, let's just stop right here and see what this is going to look like if we add these elements to our store. So we need to go back into our HTML and find where all of our items of our store are stored. We can come in here and we know that each one of our items are this div section right here. So obviously the parent of that is where they're all stored. We're just going to give this a data store container attribute. We can just take this, copy it, come into our store.js here, and we could just say const store item container is equal to document.querySelector. This is a data attribute. And there we go. Now we have access to the actual container, and we can just append these onto the end. So we can just say .append child of our store item. Now if I save this, you're going to notice nothing is actually changed over here, so we clearly have some form of error. Let's take a look at what our error is. We can just inspect, go to our console, and you can see it says cannot read property append child of null. What that means is our selector up here for our store item container is clearly not working. We're not actually getting anything selected. Let's go back to our store HTML. You can see we gave this an attribute data store container, but I never actually saved the file. That's what this white dot up here means. So if I save this, we now should see that when we scroll down, we have all of our different items being added to the end of our list. You can see they don't actually have an image yet because we didn't add that. They don't have a price and they don't have a category, but you can see each one is added. We have red, yellow, blue, orange, green, purple, light gray, dark gray, just like we have up here. They're all being added to the list. What we need to do is fill in the rest of the information. So let's go back to our items JSON and do our category next. Inside of our store, we can pretty much just copy what we did for name. And all we need to do is just change this to say category. Over here, the variable will be called category, category, and category. Now, if we save and scroll down, you can see the category is now being properly populated for each one of these. Now, the image and price are going to be a little bit trickier, so let's just take a look at the image. You can see each one of these has a source of dummyimage.com/420 by 260. All of them have the exact same image. As you can see, if I scroll down here, the only thing different is the color at the end. So what I'm going to do is just take this source at the beginning, copy this into a global variable. We can just say const image URL. It's just a constant variable, and we're going to set it equal to this image URL right here. And then down here, let's just copy our code so we can select the image, which has the attribute of data image. And we want to take our image.source, and we need to set it here equal to a value, which is going to be this image right here, this image URL. And we need to add the color to the end of it. And if we look over here, the color just goes twice onto the end of the image. We can say image source is equal to, what we need to do is string interpolation. We want to use the base image URL, then we'll put a slash. Then we want to get the color. We'll say item.image color, I believe it's called. Let's just check. Yep, image color. We need to do that a second time. So slash, and we're going to put in item.image color. Now our image should be populated. If we scroll down, you can see all of our images are populated for each one of these. And the only thing remaining is our price. So let's add our price in. It's going to be very similar to what we did for category. So I'm just going to copy that down here. We're going to say price, data price. We need to change the price.inner text. And you may think we can just say like price cents. I think that's what it is. We just come over here, price cents, yep. And if we just, divide that by 100, for example, you would think that would be all we need. And if we save that, you're going to notice it doesn't actually keep the decimal places or put the $ in place for us. And it's a little bit annoying to do the math yourself to put the $, put the decimal places. So we're going to let JavaScript take care of that for us. And there's something called INTL, which stands for internationalization. It's an object inside of JavaScript that has a bunch of nice features for writing out things like currencies, as well as things like list and translating between different languages with dates and times and so on. So what we can do is just come in here. We can say INTL dot, And what we want to do is a number format. So we're going to format a number in some form of internationalization, which just means like a language. We'll just hit tab. And then what we need to do is we need to create a new one of these. So we're just going to say new international number format. Of course, no capitals here, since this is an object we're creating. And the first thing you pass in is the locale. This is like your language. If you pass in undefined, it's just going to give you the current language of the person using your computer. So mine is English, so it's going to give me English here. So we're going to pass in undefined, and then we can pass in a set of options. And this will allow us to actually set this up to be a currency. So all we need to do is pass in a style here, which is currency, and then we need to pass the actual currency that we're using, which in our case is US dollars. Now, if we just set this to a variable, we'll call formatter. What we can do is we can use this formatter to set our price. So we can say formatter.format, which is a function, and we just pass it in the price. And we need to, of course, convert this to dollars since it's in cents. Now, if we save, you can see it properly formats all of these with the correct decimal place notation as well as the $ at the beginning. But one thing you'll notice is that we need to do this here, as well as we need to do this inside of our shopping cart for all of these currencies as well. And it's a little bit cumbersome to write this formatter out each time and then write out formatter.format. It's a lot to remember in order to properly format a currency. So what I want to do is create a utility function that does this for us. So back over here, what we can do is create a new folder. We're just going to call it util. You can call it utilities, call it whatever you want. This is just going to contain some really small JavaScript files that contain a single function, maybe a couple functions, but each one is going to do one particular thing. And the first one we want to do is some form of currency formatter. So we're going to call this format currency.js. And this is just going to export a default function called format currency. This is just going to take in a currency. And all we want to do inside of here is essentially everything we did inside of our store.js. We want to create a formatter, which we can actually do outside this function. So we only ever create one formatter. And then we just want to return the formatted version of that amount. So we can just say formatter.format amount. So this function right here does essentially the exact same thing as what we have here, but now we just need to import that and use it. So we can say import format currency from /util, util/format currency.js. And now we can take that format currency function and use it down here. So instead of calling this formatter and creating a formatter, we can just call format currency and it does all of the work for us. We save these different files. You're going to notice our currencies still work as before, but we abstracted out all of this code. As you can see, all this formatting code, we abstracted it out into its own file. That way in our store.js, we just call this function. It makes sense. It's really easy to read, and it's so much better for your code to have these short little functions taken out over here into like their own file or their own section of the code. That way, when you read store.js, you don't have to actually read all of this weird formatter code and understand it. You just read format currency and you know exactly what it does. So now with that done, we can go back into our store.html. We can actually remove all of these different items that are hard-coded inside of here. We just clap small so it's easy to delete. We can highlight all of these, delete them, and just be left with a completely empty store here, just like this. Now when we save, you can see only our new values that we created are being added here, and none of the hard-coded ones are showing up. So this is all of our items.json added to the page for us, and that's completely done. So with that out of the way, we finished that feature, and we're on to the next feature, which is this entire shopping cart button, which is obviously a much larger feature than just rendering these items from the JSON file. So what I want to do is think about all of the different aspects of this shopping cart and figure out where the best place to start is. So let's just create a JavaScript file to contain our shopping cart. We're going to call it shopping cart.js. I'm going to do a very similar thing to what I did in store.js with this setup store function. I'm just going to create a function, which I'm going to export, calling it setup shopping cart. And then what we're going to do inside of our script.js is just import setup shopping cart. We need to get that from /shoppingcart.js, and then we can call setup shopping cart, just like that. So now inside of our shopping cart, let's think of all the different functionalities we need for our shopping cart. The first thing that we need to be able to do is add items to it. So we can say add items to cart. Next thing we need to be able to do is remove items from cart. Then we need to be able to show/hide the cart when clicked. And we also need to be able to show/hide the cart when it has no items or when it goes from 0 to 1 item. Essentially, whenever we lose items from our cart, we want this button to disappear. And when we add an item to the cart, we want it to appear when it has at least 1 item in it. We need to be able to show/hide this cart as well as the cart button itself. So we'll call this cart button. Another thing we need to be able to do is persist across multiple pages, and we need to calculate an accurate total, and finally handle multiple of the same item in the cart. So that is a lot of things that our shopping cart needs to do, and this probably isn't everything. This is just everything I thought of off the top of my head based on what I see in our mockup as well as in our working example. So then the next step is to figure out where the best place to start the shopping cart is. You may think we'll just start at the top of the list with adding items, but we don't already have a shopping cart where we can add items to. We don't have a way to open and close it. It really doesn't make sense to start with adding the items. It probably makes more sense to start with this section, which is showing and hiding the cart whenever we click on the cart button, because this requires nothing else to be set. We can just do this with the hard-coded information inside of our shopping cart. We don't have to worry about saving. We don't have to worry about loading, persisting, none of that. All we have to worry about is click this button, show this, click this button, hide this. So this is, I think, the best place for us to start. I'm going to take this out of the list, move it down here, and this is what we're going to work on, showing and hiding the cart when it is clicked. So in order to do that, we need to get access to our cart button, as well as the information inside of the cart. So in our store.html, let's just minimize all of this stuff so that we have just these different sections. And this section down here is for our cart. And an easy way to figure this out is, again, just by inspecting our page. What we can do is just click on this cart here, kind of scroll up to the parent, and you'll see we have margin bottom 4, top 0, all that. And this lines up perfectly with what's right here. So we know this section contains our cart. But we need to find 2 sections. We need to find this button. So if we just inspect for the button, you can see that we have this, path stroke SVG, this button. And if we just, copy this list of classes and search over here, you can see our button is right here. It brings us to it. And it's inside of, if we just scroll up a little bit, this section right here. We can just minimize this, and then we have our button right here. We need to add some kind of attribute to this so we can select this button. We'll just call it data cart button. Now, the next thing we need to do, once we have our button, is to figure out what this entire section is that pops up here. So again, best way to do this, just click on our element picker, try to get the widest selection we can. When we click on that, you're going to see, if we just kind of hover up the list, if we click on hover this, you can see it again is still just the section we want. And if we go one step further, you'll see that this still is just the section that we want. It looks like it actually covers the button, but that's just margin. But really, we can just kind of experiment by hiding different sections of this until we figure out what we want. And we know the class invisible will hide things. Let's start down here with this section. Let's just give it a class of invisible, if I spell invisible properly. And if we do that, you can see it only hides this part of our cart. So we know that clearly this section is not what we want to select. So let's just copy that invisible class and move it up to here. What happens when we add invisible here? We click enter, you can see it makes all of that section disappear. But one slight problem is that we actually can't click this add to cart button anymore because it still has this section, if I hover here, showing up on our page. A little bit tricky to tell because it's invisible, but if I give this a color, for example, I just say background color red, you can see this entire section is covering our page. So we need to really move our invisible up onto this section. So if we just copy this invisible class, oops, just the invisible class, and we move it up here instead, now you can see that red box has disappeared. I can click add to cart, no problem. So this is the section we need to add invisible to. And this is going to be this div up here. Let's just remove it for now. This is going to be the div that contains all these classes. I can just copy them, and then I can come over here and search for them. And you can see right here, this div is where we want to add our data cart class to in order to say that this is what we're going to be selecting to hide when we click on our cart button over here. So we can just say data, we're going to call this cart items wrapper. So this is the thing that wraps all of our cart items. So now we have our data cart items wrapper and a data cart button. We can use both these in our shopping cart.js. So let's just put them up here above our function, const. We'll have cart button equals document.query selector. Let's just get rid of this search here. There we go. This is going to be data cart button. And then we're going to have our cart items wrapper, which is document.query selector. This is a data attribute again. We can just paste that in since I copied it straight from the HTML. So now when we click on this cart button, we want to toggle the invisible class on and off for this section. So we can just say cart button.add event listener on click. And all I want to do inside of here, I just want to take our cart items wrapper. I want to take our class list. I want to toggle, and I want to toggle the invisible class. So now when I click on this cart button, you can see it is toggling that section right here, and it still lets me click add to cart. So we know we're selecting the right element. So now with that complete, we need to think about which one of these steps is going to be the next easiest to handle. And this may seem a little bit weird, but I personally think the next easiest to handle is adding items to the cart, because a lot of these other sections won't work unless we have the ability to add items to the cart. For example, removing items doesn't make sense unless you can already add items to the cart, because if you can't add something, you have nothing to remove. Same with showing and hiding the cart when there are no items. If you can't add an item to the cart, then obviously you can't ever have an item, so this doesn't work until you have the ability to add items or remove items, and to remove items, you need the ability to add items. Next is persisting across multiple pages. This is something I generally like to save till the end because it requires a lot of copy pasting, and if you do it early, then you need to copy paste over and over and over again, and that's just no fun. Next, calculating an accurate total. Again, we need items in our cart to do that, and then handling multiple of the same item in the cart. Same, again, we need to have items in the cart. So all of these are pointing back to this one section of adding items to the cart. So what I want to do is just copy this. We'll just bring it down here a little ways. I want to think about all the different concepts around adding items to the cart. So we need to be able to handle the click event for adding. We also need to be able to here handle multiple of the same item in the cart. I'll just bring that down to this section because they're kind of one and the same. It happens when we add an item to the cart. We also need to be able to calculate an accurate total. That's going to be down here as well because it has to do with adding an item to the cart. You need to do this whenever you add an item. So with this general list of things that we need to do, let's first start with the most obvious, which is handling this click event listener. It's the first step in the chain of actions that occur when you try to add an item. So whenever we click on add to cart, we need to do something here. So to do that, we just need to create a function inside of our shopping cart, which will allow us to add an item to the cart. So we can just say function add to cart, and then in here, we'll do our add to cart code. And we need to export this so we have access to it inside of our store.js, since this is where our add event listeners are set up. Now for add to cart, we could pass in a whole item, but since we have these nice IDs inside of our items JSON, I just want to use the ID for identifying everything. That way, if for some reason our red item changes its price to, $17 instead of $16, we don't store this 16 inside of our shopping cart. We're just storing the ID. So that way, if this does change, we will see that change and be able to show that change. So here, we're just going to pass in the ID of our item. Now with this ID, what I want to do is just add this to some shopping cart variable. I'm going to create a variable called shopping cart. I'm going to set it equal to an empty array for now. We have nothing in our shopping cart to begin with. And what I want to do is I want to take our shopping cart and I want to append this to it. So I'll say push. And instead of just pushing the ID, we also need to be able to handle the quantity as well. I'm going to do this as an object with an ID, which is going to be our ID, and a quantity, which is going to be 1. Because we need to be able to handle how many of the item are in our cart. For now, we're not going to worry about what happens when we add an item to the cart twice. For now, we're just going to be handling adding an item to the cart one time, and then we'll come back to that. This is what I like to do. I like to tackle things in small incremental steps and slowly add more and more complexity to it. It just makes it easier to work with. So now we've added this item to our shopping cart. And if we just come in here, we say console.log shopping cart, and then we actually use this add to cart function inside of our store.js, we should actually see this. Let's get rid of this log here. And inside of our setup store, we need to set up a global event listener for all of our different buttons for adding to the cart. And in order to select those buttons, all I want to do is just minimize all this, go into our template, find that button, and we'll just say data add to cart button. Let's copy this selector here, go into our store.js, and we can say document.add event listener on click. What we want to do is we want to see if e.target.matches the selector that we just made, which is this one. If it does match that, and then inside of here, we want to run some code for adding to the cart. So we can just say add to cart, which we need to import up here from shoppingcart.js. It did that automatically for us. And we need to pass in the ID. So to get the ID, what we need to do is we need to take our e.target.closest, and here we can actually get the element that has the ID of data store item. Because remember, we put the ID on that data store item attribute. So we get the parent that has the data store item. And the reason this works is this button has this parent all the way up here, which has the data store item attribute. And then on here, what we can do is we can access the dataset.item ID. We can just pass it .dataset.item ID. And this right here is going to be our ID for our element that we're adding to the cart. And if we save this, then we come over here and we inspect, go to our console, just ignore that team.js error, click add to cart. You're going to see our cart has one item with an ID of 1 and a quantity of 1. We click it down here. We're going to have two items with an ID of 1, ID of 3, and both have a quantity of 1. But of course, if we add red again, it's going to add a third red to our cart with the same quantity of 1. This is something that we're going to fix later, but for now, we're able to add one item to our cart, and it shows up in our shopping cart. The next step is going to be rendering that shopping cart out. Let's just close out of this, and what we want to do back in our shopping cart, whenever we add an item to the cart, instead of logging this out, we want to call some function like render cart. We'll just create this function render cart. And in here, we're going to go through all of the code to render our shopping cart, this array, inside of our shopping cart on the HTML. And luckily, this shopping cart is very similar to each one of the items in our store. You'll see really the only difference is there's no category. We have this quantity here, as well as this close button. And if we save this and go to our store.html and we find our shopping cart, we can see, whoops, we just close this out, open up our shopping cart. We can see inside of this div up here, we have a section which contains all of our shopping cart items. And just like before, the best way to find which items we need to select, we can just use our nice inspector tool, kind of scroll up the list until what we want is highlighted by everything. You can see this highlights too much. So this MB6 looks to be each one of our items. As you can see when I hover, is properly hovering each one of our items. So wherever we have MB6 as our class, right here and here, each one of these is our shopping cart item. So what we want to do is to be able to turn this into a template. So I'm just going to copy this, come down here and create a new template. And this one is going to have an ID, which is cart item template. And we're going to put all of the code for our cart item inside of there. Let's minimize this other template. And we're just going to minimize our shopping cart itself up here, just so we have just our template open. And here what we need to do is again select all of our different sections. This first section here is going to be our image. We can just say data image. We also need to be able to come up here and select our data item here. And this again is going to be where we store our ID, which allows us to reference which item we're removing when we get to the removal section. It looks like our button for removing from cart already has the data remove from cart button attribute. We can just leave that on there. That's perfect. Next thing, if we scroll down here, we can see our name is right here. So we can just say data name, get rid of the placeholder value, just like that. Then we're going to have our quantity, which is just data quantity. We can get rid of the placeholder inside of here as well. And then lastly, data price. And let's get rid of the placeholder in there. And same thing here, we'll get rid of our placeholder source for our image. So now we got rid of all the placeholder data and we added all of our different data attributes for the things that we want to show inside of our cart. The next step is obviously going to be rendering these out. And the nice thing is our store, all the code inside of our render store item is essentially the exact same for what we're going to do to render a cart item inside of our shopping cart here. So we can just copy pretty much all of this code, just like this. I'm just going to paste this into our render cart. And I want to do this inside of a loop. So we're going to do shopping cart dot for each entry. We want to run all of this code. So we'll just paste it in. Now, obviously, this isn't quite 100% right, but it's very close to what we need. First, our category, we don't need this at all. We can get rid of the category because it's not in our shopping cart. Next up, our image is going to be different as well. Our image URL here is actually a different image URL for our shopping cart. As you can see, it's a much smaller image. So if we go over to our section here and we just scroll down until we can find where these items are, inside of these MB6s here, you can see our dummy image is 210 by 130. So we're going to copy that. We're going to use that up here as our image URL. So const image URL is equal to that image URL right there. So now we have our image being properly processed. Everything else is exactly the same. Price is going to be exactly the same. But some of the main differences, our container is just data item. We just gave it a property data item. Data name is correct, data image is correct, data price is correct. But all of these are referencing the item. Here we have item dot, item dot, item dot. So we need to get our item from this entry. So we can just say const item is equal to items, which we need to import. So let's come all the way up here and import all of our items, which is just going to be way up here actually. Import items from /items.json. And what we need to do is find the item that has the same ID as the item in our entry. So we can say entry.id is equal to i.id. This will give us the correct item that has the same ID as our entry. So whatever entry in our shopping cart we're in, it'll get the item for that. And here, we're just going to change this to be cart item. But instead of renaming it all by hand, a handy trick is if you hover over this and hit Control D after you select this, it'll select all of them in a row that share the same name. And we can just change this to cart item. And you can see it changes all of the things that were named store item that we selected with that Control D one by one. That just allows you to rename things really quickly. Next up, this cart item template, we need to import that. So we can just say const cart item template is equal to document.query selector. And this, I believe, had the ID of cart item template, just like that. Now, really, the only thing left to do is our quantity for rendering inside of our cart. We want to be able to do our quantity down here with our price, as well as our quantity right here. We're only going to show it if it's greater than 1. So let's just copy name here. This is going to be very similar. We're going to call this instead quantity. We're going to do data quantity, quantity.innerText, and this is just going to be here, an X, which is just standing for the multiplication symbol, and then entry.quantity. And then for our price, we need to get our price in cents, and we need to multiply it by our entry.quantity. Because if we have 2 items, this should be 2 times our current price, and then so on for more and more items. Now, if we save this, you're going to see that really nothing changes because we're not actually rendering our items until we click the add button. So if we click the add button, you're going to notice nothing actually happens. Let's look to see if we have any errors. And of course, we probably do. So if we scroll down here a little ways, you'll see we get uncaught error, cannot read property ID of undefined. If we click here, it'll bring us to the line where this is occurring. Just expand this out. You can see it cannot get the ID of item. So clearly our item is not being found properly. So to see what the issue is, we're just going to put a simple console.log in here. We're going to log out our entry. We're going to log out our items. We're going to log both of these just to see what they are. We go back to inspect and we click add to cart. That'll call our code. You can see we get an ID 1, and this is a string, and our items here has an ID, which is an actual number. So we need to convert one of these from a string to a number and so on. And actually, instead of doing that here, what I want to do is when we add an element to our cart, I want to take the ID and I want to parse the int of this ID. And actually, instead of doing it here in our add cart, I want to do this all the way back inside of our store, because our store is where we're getting that ID right here. I want to parse this as an integer. So we're converting it from a string to an integer right here. Let me just make sure I have my parentheses set up correctly. Just like that. And now, hopefully, if I add an item to the cart and I inspect, we should get at least a different error. And you can see it says format currency is not defined. Okay, that makes sense. We didn't import format currency, so let's do that up here. Import format currency from /util/format currency.js. Now add to cart, and let's see what happened next. Of course, we probably got another error. Cart item container is not defined. We scroll all the way down here. We have this cart item container variable, which we haven't defined as anything yet. We need to figure out what is the container for all of our different cart items. And again, a simple right-click inspect is going to give that to us for us. We can just click until we get a section that contains all the information we want. And if we hover this, you'll see that this is just the section that contains our cart items. We go one step up, it also contains our total. So we need to find this class. I'll just copy it and search for it, and you'll see it's right here. We'll say data cart items container. There we go. And let's just copy this. We'll actually just call it cart items. Don't need the container there. bring this into our shopping cart. We'll say const, what is that variable called? Cart item container equals document.query selector. Get rid of this search so we can see what we're typing and paste that in. Now if we save, click add to cart, you'll notice that it populated this into our cart. We could add blue and it's adding into our cart, but you'll notice what happens is it's adding it to the cart and keeping everything that was in there before. So it's adding our shopping cart again and it's adding it again. You can see this is our first shopping cart, just one red. Then red and blue was our second shopping cart and our third was red, blue, red. So what we need to do is make it so that our cart deletes all the items that are currently in it before it adds all the new items. So we're just going to take our cart items container. What we're going to do is set the inner HTML to an empty string. This is going to clear out our cart that has everything in it. So now it's only going to have the items that we add into our cart, and it's not going to show our previous carts each time. So it's going to clear out all of our items for us. Now, next step, if we just scroll down here, we did add items to the cart. That worked just fine. We did handle click event for adding. That worked fine. Now we need to handle multiple of the same item, because you can see we have red here and red here, but they should be collapsed into one. Also, this ×1 shouldn't be showing up if there's only one item. So for our quantity, if we have more than one, then we want to show it. So let's just put that simple if check in there. And now we just add an item. You can see there's no ×2 or anything next to it because we only have one item inside the cart. Same thing if we add yellow, blue. But now what we want to do is when we add red, instead of adding it to the bottom, we want to add it to our currently existing red. So what we need to do is in our add to cart, we need to check to see if we already have an item with that ID. So we can just say const existing item is equal to shopping cart.find. And what we're going to do in here, we have an entry. And we need to see if the entry.id is equal to the ID we passed in. That'll give us the existing item. Then if we have an existing item, all I want to do is take the existing item.quantity and add 1 to it. And if you just put ++ at the end, that'll add 1 to the variable and resave it. It's the same exact thing as doing existing item.quantity is equal to that item +1. This is the exact same thing as just ++. Otherwise, if it doesn't exist, let's add it and then render our cart. So now we add red, we add blue, and if we add another red, you can see it adds it on here with our ×2, ×3, ×4, and the price here is being popularly calculated based on how many reds we have. So now that we have the ability to add items to our cart, and if I just refresh this page, I want to get rid of what's in the beginning of our cart. Our cart shouldn't have items in it to start with. So remember, our items are these MB6s. Just delete these. And now, collapse this up, you'll see we have nothing in our cart to begin with. And our total should obviously also just say 0, for example. This total eventually we're going to calculate, but it should start out as nothing because there's nothing in our cart. Now when we add something, you can see it shows up in our cart, but our icon here for calculating the number of items in our cart is incorrect. So let's find where this is. If I just do a simple inspect, select it like this, you can see it has this massive class. So let's just select this class by copying, doing a search, and boom, here we go. We have our item 2 here. This should just be blank for now because we're going to populate this in JavaScript, and we'll say data cart quantity. And if we just get rid of this search here, copy this, put it in our shopping cart.js, const cart quantity is going to be equal to document that query selector of that data attribute. There we go. Let's just make sure we spell document correctly here. That way everything loads over here. There we go. So now what I can do is just copy this cart quantity down in our render cart. What we can do is just say cart quantity.inner text is equal to shopping cart.length. That'll give us the number of items in our cart. Save that. We'll see that nothing's happening because we're not actually rendering our cart right away. But if we add an item, you can see it says 1. Add another one, it says 2. If we add another red, it'll still say 2 because we only have 2 unique items inside of our cart. Now, if we scroll back to our list of things that we need to do, we still need to calculate an accurate total. And we've done handling multiple of the same item in the cart, so let's get rid of that. So the next step is really just calculating an accurate total. All we need to do for that, we can just come up here, and we need to be able to calculate what the total of all of our different items are. So if we just add a bunch of reds, we'll add a yellow here and a blue. There we go, we have a bunch of items. So if we added all these together, we would get the total down here. So in order to do that calculation, we first need to select our total dollar amount. We go back to our store here. All we need to do is just kind of scroll until we find that. And that may take a little while to find if we're just scrolling around. I mean, it is right here. But what you could do is that same inspect trick if you wanted. So we just say data total, we'll say cart total, and then we'll just copy that, save this file back into our shopping cart all the way at the top. We've done this a million times. Cart total is equal to document.querySelector. Oops, and we need to get that data attribute of cart total. Then we can scroll down here a little ways, and we need to render out our cart total. We need to set the inner text of this to be equal to formatting of currency of some value. For now, I'm just going to hard code 0 in there, but we need this to be some value. In our store, we can get rid of this hard coded value here. You can see that right now, it's not actually doing anything, but if I add an item to our cart, it populates that as 0. So what we need to do is calculate this total. So how exactly are we going to go about that? We have our shopping cart itself, which contains the IDs and how many of them that we are. The next thing we need to do is actually get the item for each one of these, which will give us the price. What I want to do is just loop through our shopping cart for a second time. So I can say shopping cart dot, and instead of doing a for each, I'm just going to do a reduce, because we're going to reduce our shopping cart down to one single total. And I'm just going to call this const total equals, and then this total is what we pass to our format currency. There we go. And this total is actually going to be calculated in cents because that's what all of our price are in. So this is going to be total cents, which we're just going to divide by 100. So with reduce, what we know is that this is going to take a function, and then it's also going to take a default value. With us, we're going to start by counting from 0, and inside of our function, we need to pass it both our accumulator, which is our sum, as well as each entry. So we have our sum and our entry. And now what we need to do is we need to constantly add to our sum all the different values from our entry. And the first thing we need to do is get our item. We can actually just copy this straight from here. We can say our item is going to be equal to finding from our items the entry ID that equals our i.id, which is our item ID. That'll give us our item, which will give us our price in cents. And all we need to do is take our sum. We need to return that, but we also need to add to it our item.price in cents times our entry.quantity. So now if I save this, click add to cart, you can see our price is 16. Add it again, we get 32. Add again, we now have 53 being shown up inside of here. And you may notice that slight little flicker when I click add to cart. If we just take our inner HTML, we move this closer down here where we're actually looping through our different shop items, this should get rid of that flickering for us. So now we click add again, the flicker is a little bit less. So now let's go back to our list of things that we need to do because we've successfully accomplished everything that there is to adding items to the cart. We scroll up, we have removing items from the cart. We have showing and hiding the cart when there are no items in it. And then we have persisting across multiple pages. And this again, I said I want to do last. And really you could go either way with this one. But what I want to do is start with the showing and the hiding of the cart button. Because when we start from a fresh page, we have this really ugly cart showing up. I want to get rid of that. I want to make this entire thing hidden and only show up when there's an item inside of the cart. So in order to do that, what I want to do is I want to take this render cart button and actually just rename this to render cart items. Because really all this is doing is rendering the items inside of our cart. And what I want to do is create another function called render cart. We'll say function render cart. And this render cart function is going to call render cart items. But I also want to have this hide or show our cart depending on if there are items inside of the cart. And I want to call this render cart function whenever we set up our shopping cart. That way, when we first load our page, we'll have our total as well as our counter for our notification being shown up properly, especially depending on if we have items already in our cart. This is going to be really crucial when we get to this persisting section. So we'll scroll back down to this render cart. What I want to do is check to see if there are items in our shopping cart. So we can say, if our shopping cart dot length is equal to 0 here, then that means that we have no items and we want to hide our cart. We'll just call a function called hide cart. Otherwise, we want to show our cart and we want to render all of our cart items. Seems pretty straightforward. So let's create a hide cart and a show cart function. We'll say function hide cart and function show cart. And in order to hide our cart, we need to be able to access our cart. So we come back here, we want to get this section. This section contains everything about our cart. So we can just say data cart in order to select it. And if we come all the way up here, we can just say const cart equals document.query selector of data cart. And now we can come down all the way to our hide cart. We can say cart.classlist.add in invisible, just like that. And if we save, you can see our cart has disappeared because there are no items in our shopping cart, so it doesn't show up. If we add a cart, you're going to notice nothing actually happens because our show cart doesn't actually show our cart. So here, let's say cart.classList.remove invisible. Now, we add an item to our cart, you can see our cart shows up as soon as there's an item to add into it. But you'll notice it actually shows our entire cart. I only want it to show the button. I don't actually want the entire cart to be visible. So when we hide our cart, I also want to take our cart items wrapper. I want to just hide this. So we'll say classList.add invisible, just like that. So now when I add to cart, if I spell invisible correctly, now when I add to cart, you can see it's just the cart icon that pops up, and it doesn't actually have all of the actual cart itself. And then I can keep the cart up and add items to it. That'll work just fine. That way, when I do add an item to my cart starting from 0, it doesn't pop up the whole cart, just the nice little icon for us. And the reason this works is because when we hide our cart, we're making sure that our cart items wrapper is invisible to start with, no matter what. And also, what I want to do is I want to make sure by default, our cart never shows up on the page. So we're going to give it a class of invisible here. And we're going to give our cart items wrapper a class of invisible. That way it doesn't ever flash onto the page and then disappear when our JavaScript loads. It'll just always be hidden unless it needs to be shown. So back into our shopping cart.js, we scroll up to the top. That completely takes care of the section for showing and hiding the cart, depending on if we have items or not. Let's move on to removing items from the cart. We'll create a function to do that. We'll say remove from cart. We'll pass it in an ID, just like add to cart. And what we need to do is just get the existing item. We can copy that directly from up here. It's the exact same code. Then just to have a little bit of safety, I just want to say if our existing item is equal to null to return, because that means that we don't have an item, something went wrong, so just exit out immediately. Otherwise, if we do have items, what we need to do is get them from our shopping cart. So we say shopping cart.filter for each one of our entries. And we want to check where our entry .id is equal to this ID. And we want to check when those are not equal, because if they're not equal, then it means it's not this item. So we want to get all the items that are not the item we want to remove. And once we do that, we can take our shopping cart and set it equal to that. And then just render out our new cart. Now, if we set up this remove from cart to actually work, we should see that we can click the remove from cart button. So what we need to do, back into our store again, we need to scroll all the way down to our template, and we need to find that button, which has data remove from cart button. Let's copy this into our shopping cart, and we need to set up a global event listener. And you may remember earlier, we set up a global event listener in our store.js right here. So instead of copying this code multiple times, I just want to create another utility function to do this. So we could just say here, add global event listener.js. There we go. What we can do in here is export a default function, add global event listener. And what this is going to do is it's going to take the type of event, for example, click. It's going to take our selector, which is going to be the thing that we're actually selecting. If you remember here, that's our data add to cart button. And then we're going to take in a final thing, which is our callback. And then inside of here, what we need to do is essentially just copy this code because it's going to look very similar. We copy this code in here. We need to set up an event listener on the type of event that we have. So type. Then we need to see if our selector matches the target. And if that's true, then we need to call our callback. We pass it in our event. So what essentially we're doing is we're just adding an event listener to our document for our particular type, which in our case is click. Then we're running a function that checks to see if the selector we pass in matches the target that we clicked on, and if so, run the callback. Now what we can do in our store.js is just import that. So we can say import add global event listener from, this is just going to be /util/add global event listener.js. And then down here, we can add global event listener for our click. What we need to do is for this selector, so we put this selector in here, and then our callback is just going to be with our e variable inside of it, this section here. So that's just simplifying our code quite a bit. And if we save, we see our add to cart still works just as it did before. So we don't have any issues in that regard. Our code still works, which is a great thing to check. Now we can use this global event listener inside of our shopping cart for our close button. Let's just import it up here. We'll say import add global event listener from /util/add.js. I just need to copy that selector again. Now what I can do when we set up our shopping cart is add a global event listener or click on this data attribute. We want to call this function. And this function is going to be very similar to our store. I'm actually going to copy this pretty much identically. We'll just copy this here, paste it in here, and instead of adding to cart, we'll get rid of that. And here, instead of store item, this is just item, but that's going to give us our ID. Then we can just say remove from cart our ID. And I want to parse this as an integer. So we'll say parse int just like that. Oops, just like that. So now if I come in, click add cart, click add cart, click add cart, click add cart, everything's working. If I open up our cart and I click this X button, you can see it removes the item from our cart each time until we have no items left and our cart completely disappears. So we have successfully removed items from our cart. Now the next step is going to be persisting this across multiple pages, which means we need to save our data. With a shopping cart, it makes the most sense to save our data in session storage, because if you do some shopping, you add some things to your cart and then you leave and you come back a week later, you don't want to have those same items in your cart. It doesn't really make sense. So we're going to use session storage instead of local storage for persisting our data across multiple pages. So let's create a save and a load function. We'll just say function save cart and function load cart. And these are going to be pretty straightforward functions. The first thing we need is some kind of key that we're going to use for saving our information. So let's just create a constant variable for that. We're just going to say session storage key. And we're going to save this with a, prefix. And our prefix, we're just going to call shopping cart. And then we're going to call this actual variable cart. And again, the reason I use prefixes like shopping cart at the beginning is because when you're developing on localhost, everything is running on the same port and the same server, which means you'll have the same local storage variables between all of your applications, which generally runs into bugs if you name the generic things such as active or user. You're going to run into problems, but if you prefix all of them with the name of your application, you don't worry about that problem when you're developing. It doesn't matter when you deploy, but for development, it makes life easier. Now we're going to copy this session storage key, and all the way down wherever we have that save cart function, there it is, we can just say that we want to do session storage dot set item. This is going to be for our key, and we want to just take our cart and stringify it. So shopping cart, just like that. And now we can call save cart whenever we do things to our cart. For example, if we add an item to the cart, let's save it. If we remove an item from the cart, let's save it. So now we add this, and then maybe remove an item, we'll add another red. If we inspect our page and go to the application tab, you'll see inside of our session storage, we have our shopping cart, and our shopping cart contains the item with ID 1, quantity 2, that's our red, and then ID 3, quantity 1, which is our blue. And if we delete blue, you can see it now got rid of that from our shopping cart. So now we have our items properly being put into our session storage. Final step is just going to be to load that data. So in our load, we want to get our cart, which is equal to session storage.get item with that session storage key. And we want to return the parsing of that cart. And if there's nothing in our session storage to begin with, we're going to default to an empty array. Then we can call load cart and set our shopping cart up here equal to that. So now if I save, refresh, you'll notice nothing is happening right now. But if I add some items to our cart, open it up, you can see we have these items in our refresh. You'll notice they're actually not being loaded. So we're clearly running into some form of issue. What I want to do is just inspect the page and see if we get an error. We go to our console, you can see the only error we're getting is that team.js one, which is really not an error. So if we go over to our application, you can see our shopping cart has items inside of it, as you can see down here, but why are they not being populated? In order to see, let's just take our shopping cart and print it out. We can say console.log shopping cart. Let's just inspect to see what our shopping cart looks like. You can see it's an array with nothing in it. So clearly this load cart is not actually populating our shopping cart. Now let's scroll down a little ways. We'll get rid of that log for now. Over to our load cart, we're getting our session storage item. So let's just see if we just do a console.log of our cart in here, what does this actually look like? So we can inspect. Go to our console, you can see this is getting null, which is really strange because in our application, we have our shopping cart, which has information inside of it. So it should be getting that item from our session storage. The only thing that I can think of is maybe save cart is being called at some point before load cart, and it's saving an empty cart, and then it's being recalled with an actual cart. That's a little far-fetched, but let's just see if that's the case. We'll just say console.log save. So hopefully this doesn't show up in our log. If we go to console, you can see it doesn't actually say save. So that is not the issue. We can get rid of that. The next thing to look at is just clearing out our session storage. Sometimes you just get bugs where you have data in your storage that you shouldn't, so let's just clear that. Clear our local storage, which is already empty, but just in case, we'll clear cookies. Everything's empty. So we'll try refreshing again, add some items to our cart, refresh, and they're still not showing up. This is really strange. Also, I noticed here this cart button, add event listener, should really be moved inside of our setup shopping cart function. So let's just move that in there. Not related to this bug, but something that's important anyway. So we can add our items to the cart, but for some reason, when we're refreshing our page, our items in our cart are not being saved, even though they're actually being saved inside of our session storage. We just open it up right here. One possible explanation is maybe this weird bug here I'm getting with the team.js is causing a problem. So if you're getting weird bugs like that, we can just delete our dist folder and delete our cache folder here and rerun our parcel start. So npm start here. That's going to rebuild everything from scratch. And maybe that'll do enough to actually save this for us. So let's just refresh over here, add some items to our cart, click refresh again, and it's still not working. And if we go to that inspect again, we're still getting null being printed out. So kind of my last ditch effort, if that is still the issue, is instead of doing our load cart here, we're just going to load cart inside of our setup shopping cart. So we could say shopping cart is equal to loading our cart here before we render. Now we can see that that actually worked. So it seems like this weird bug that I'm getting with parcel from the unexpected token team.js, that's what's causing our problem. I don't know why that's happening, but by just moving our code inside of our setup shopping cart, which is really where it should exist, that fixes all of the problems. Now we can get rid of this log down here, and our code works just fine. We can remove some items from our cart, refresh, and our cart is still there. So now the last step, if we just add a few items to our cart, is to make sure that this persists across multiple pages. Because right now when we go to our home, we just have our default, static cart that does nothing. Same with our team page. What we need to do is copy a lot of the code from our store over to our other pages. Let's just collapse a bunch of these different sections. And you can see what we need to do is copy our cart and copy our template for our cart item over to our different pages. So we're on our store page. We'll go to our team page, minimize everything down one more time. In this bottom section is our static cart. We're going to delete that and paste in our new cart. Now when we save and we go over to our team section, you're going to notice the cart doesn't show up because it's not running our JavaScript. We need to import our JavaScript, script, and we called this script.js, defer. Now if I refresh, still not actually doing anything. Let's just come in here, do an inspect, look at our console, see if there's an error that says cannot read property content of null. And the reason for that, this is in our render store item. Well, we don't have a store on this page. So inside of our store.js, we need to just make sure that we don't actually set up our store unless we have a store. So if our store item container is not existing, so if store item container equals null, then I just want to return. I just want to exit out of here immediately because we don't have a store to set up. So now you can see the shopping cart shows up. I can delete items from it, refresh, and now it only has those two items. So our store works, our team works. The final step is for our home page. And again, we just need to copy this code. Let's just minimize it down so it's easier to work with. Whoops. Minimize that down. There we go. Copy our cart and template. And here, again, minimize this down. Delete that bottom cart section and paste in our new cart. Now if I save, refresh, you can see, again, nothing's happening because I need to import that script tag. We'll say script.js, defer, and now if I refresh, you can see we have our cart, can delete something from it, refresh, and it persists across all of our different pages. And that's all it takes to create this shopping cart project. I really hope that you tried this out yourself and really scratched your head and tried to figure out all of these different solutions before watching me do it. And even if you got stuck along the way, that's perfectly okay. Honestly, I expect you to get stuck along the way because it's a pretty large project, but hopefully you're able to look at this video that I created, kind of unstuck yourself, and then finish out the rest of the project yourself and hopefully it wasn't too much of a hassle. And with that said, I want to give you a huge thank you for making it through this entire course. I know it's a long course, incredibly difficult, and you put in tons of hours of hard work to get here, but it has definitely paid off. I can assure you your skills as a JavaScript developer have drastically improved since the beginning of this course, and I really hope that you see that for yourself as well. Again, thank you very much for taking this course, and I really hope you enjoyed it.